Everybody,
Hi.
coming to you with a little marriage check-in, and we want to talk about communication today. So, communication is one of those things that people always talk about with marriage. There's chapters on it in every marriage book, that kind of thing, and there's a reason for that. So, we were talking about how in this current pandemic quarantine thing, it takes on some new dynamics where you are around each other more. So you need to communicate more, and there's more communication in some senses. But I know for us, sometimes there's less communication in a slowed down, unhurried, heart-to-heart way. And so it just comes with its challenges, both of those things. The fact that you're around each other so much more, and you communicate a lot more, just gives more opportunities for miscommunications, and then the fact that it's harder to find that time to really have deeper communication has its own challenges too. So it's interesting. So thought we'd start off with just thinking through biblically, I guess theologically, biblically, about just a couple of thoughts about communication and why it's important. So one of the things that I thought of was just the fact that God has communicated. Like, we have a God who communicates, who has spoken, who's revealed himself and his heart, his mind. And he's doing that. He's done that so clearly for us, and so I think there's something in that. Maybe even some way that's part of his image in us, perhaps. And then secondly, we see that in Christ himself. He's the supreme communication of God, who reveals so clearly God. Like, we don't have to doubt what God thinks or what God wants, or how to live in relationship with him. We know he's communicated so clearly for us, and just even the way he communicates, right, is such an example to us, a model for us, not only to receive and enjoy the way he communicates and his patience and gentleness and truth and grace, but also then that's a model for how we would reflect that. So on top of that, like the theological, there's tons of verses we could go to in Scripture. What are a couple that you think are worth mentioning?
Well, I think first, James in chapter 1 talks about being quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. And I just think that's so key, just on the listening part, and being slow to speak. Like, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And then also Proverbs 18:2 says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. And again, that goes with James, but as we listen to each other, we are going to be seeking to understand. But if it's our own opinion we want, then we're not listening. We're just quick to speak and want to share our thoughts and whatever pertains to that situation or what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think when we're not listening well, it's interesting because I think most of the time we expect the other person to be listening well, or even to be listening with supernatural powers where they can read our minds, right? Even though we're not necessarily listening well to others, our spouse, we're expecting our spouse to listen with some kind of what do you call that? I don't remember. But anyway, so we had an interesting experience this week with communication, and why don't you kind of tell them, and I'll correct you where you're wrong here.
No, you have to sit and listen. Well, we were trying to figure out some calendar stuff, and so it was kind of in the evening, and we realized we hadn't really talked through it, and by the time of night I was just done. I can't think logically or in a way that's really going to help us or add to the conversation at that time. And so we kind of had talked about maybe taking some time in the morning to talk through things, and I thought that's what we were doing, but then I had something early the next morning, and so it went just a few minutes late, and then Tim had forgotten to do something, and so by the time he came in, he was just walking out the door to go over to the office, and I was kind of confused and trying to figure out, weren't we going to talk? And so kind of this miscommunication resulted in us, I guess, being a little impatient with each other and just a little, yeah, I don't know. Like I was kind of hurt and offended because of assumptions that were there, and then, but I also, we just didn't communicate well. It's basically like it wasn't even anything specific. It was just like not clear communication, and I think Tim had kind of forgotten to, and it was just like this trickle effect that all resulted from not being clear and not checking in the morning, like, hey, are we still going to talk before you go in, kind of thing.
And I think on my side, I didn't communicate well, and just communicating that, hey, I'm planning on trying to get to the office at a certain time, and that's important to me. So if we can't do it because of that, then we'll have to do it another time, talk another time. So yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? And it ended well, but we saw some of these elements there where we were making assumptions. I expected her to know that I was trying to get to the office at a certain time. I didn't communicate that well. And in some sense, she expected that we were still doing this and that there weren't any other things that were going to interfere with that. And so, that's just initially, it just exposes how many those assumptions are dangerous. And what's really weird is how we can either take it personally or get impatient with each other just because the other person doesn't understand. It makes you wonder, like, what's the heart behind that? Why do I get impatient with that? It's like when someone doesn't hear you. It's even something that maybe your spouse is hard of hearing. Like, why do we get impatient with that? Why? It doesn't make sense necessarily, but there's something about us wanting to be heard and not having to repeat ourselves, and it's inconvenient for us. It's interesting what's going on in our hearts and what's kind of ruling our communication. Definitely, even in those, just simple miscommunications can still be very kind of selfish. It's sobering to think about our hearts in those moments.
And that's what I was thinking. I think it's so easy for communication to be about us. And so even like in Proverbs where it's talking about, a fool is only about expressing his own opinion. It's not even just expressing your opinion as much as it's just about me and even if it's the expressing part, but it's also just about what you did or didn't hear, or what you did or didn't do, and it's just very self-focused. And really, when we see the goal of communication is to, yes, there is a sense where we want to share, but our sharing should come from a place of, I think, humility and love.
Yeah.
And really, our communication is wanting to also draw out the other person and know. And in a situation as silly as this, as a scheduling thing, I mean, it wasn't a big deal. We've had bigger communication issues at times, for sure. But it was just a good reminder of how easy it is for us to be focused on ourselves and what we wanted and our thoughts and expectations instead of the other. And I think even with like the thoughts, like expectations, I think is a huge part of communication, and you kind of hit on it, but I think the idea of like every time, if I'm expecting you to know something or expecting you to ask me something, or like anytime there's an expectation there, I'm kind of setting you up for failure in a sense. And again, that's more about me than it is about you. It's not about loving you or even wanting to show care in a way of just sharing myself or care in where you're at.
I think it goes back to the humility you were talking about, where if we're aware that, like, hey, I misunderstand things, or I don't hear things, or I get distracted when someone's talking to me, I know I'm weak and sinful, then I'm going to extend grace because I'm humbled by looking at myself. Then I'll extend grace and not have these expectations that my spouse be perfect at communication. I think that humility is big. And then, like you said, love. Like, what if we approach these simple communication things with love? Like, I was thinking of an example. Like, I've struggled, I think more in the past. I think I've gotten better in interrupting Nicole. Like, she'll be talking, and I'll have a thought, and like I feel like I have to get that thought out. And And I, just as you were talking, I just realized that's very selfish. I'm not loving her by listening to and caring about what she's sharing from her heart. I'm loving myself, and I want to give my opinion and my thought. That's Proverbs 18:2, right? He only takes pleasure in expressing his own opinion, and that's again that idea of just self in communication. Instead of when I speak, I'm going to do it not to get it off my chest or express myself or hear my profound thoughts. I'm going to speak in order to love you and do good to you, and I'm going to listen from the same motive. And so, it's one of those things where that simple command, Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like, if we just love each other in these relational communication dynamics, I think that would go so far if we slowed ourselves down and thought about that. And then even as we sort through the back end of communication messes, maybe that's a filter or paradigm to think through. And who was I loving, and what was I, seeking in that moment? Even in the middle of it, how can I love my spouse and communicating right now? So,
I think another thing I was thinking about with communication, because there's all types of forms of communication. Sometimes it's over these just misunderstandings and not a lot of clarity. But I think too, when in marriage, obviously, there's patterns that we have in our marriage because we're sinners, and so I think it's really easy for us to kind of assume how the other person's going to respond or what they're going to say, and so then we approach the conversation with that. And so I think of James where it says to be quick to listen and slow to speak, and I think that's really applicable too in the listening, because if we really are trying to be quick to listen and slow to speak, we're not approaching. It's harder to approach the conversation in a way that is simply all about how I think you're going to respond or how this conversation is for sure going to go. And even if it does go that direction, maybe there's something I can learn, because I think sometimes if we have these assumptions of how something's going to go, we aren't actually listening. We're just trying to hear what lines up with what our assumption is, instead of trying to really hear the person and what is being communicated. And so I think it's really helpful to make sure we're putting aside all those assumptions, and even if there is a pattern, we may know, but we still don't approach a conversation expecting that to be the case. I think if there's an expectation of that, it doesn't help. We may have known that that's a pattern, and so I think more so we just need to prepare our heart to be ready to love more, to be patient, and stuff. And yeah.
It's interesting because on the one side you can learn from past communication patterns in a negative way, like you're saying, where you assume what they're going to do next and what they're going to say and what they're thinking and what their motives are behind what they're saying. But then there is a good way to learn from communication history, to where that when I say this certain thing, it's probably not going to be real helpful. If I don't give my spouse my full attention, they're probably going to feel like I'm not listening to them, even when I think I am. Or, just learning how your spouse communicates and what's helpful in communication. So there's a kind of working off the past in a negative way, and there's a working off the past that can be positive too. So I think that's helpful. And I just one other thing from my side is, I think going back to the idea of love, but for some of us, love means we need to speak less and listen more. There are some of us within our marriages where love means we need to speak more. We're so quiet, we're not sharing our hearts and who we are, we're not sharing ourselves with our spouse. And for some of us, that can be hard work, and we don't even know what to say. We don't know what our spouse asks us, what are you thinking about? And I don't know. I'm just, there's nothing going on in here. And sometimes there might not be, but I think, and this probably tends to be men, but I think it can go either way. But some of us need to love by really working at sharing what's going on inside our heads and sharing what we're thinking about and what's on our hearts. So.
Yeah, I think that's good, because I think too, it makes me think of just early on in our marriage and how we both, how different we are and how we communicate. and I'm very much a verbal processor. Tim is very much he can be a verbal
Unless it's
processor.
before coffee in the morning, then you don't go.
That's true. Don't talk to me before I have my coffee. But he's not as much. Like, he can just, he can be working in the yard and thinking through 500 things and come out back in and he has these profound thoughts or, he's figured something out. And I'm like, how do you do that? And so one of the things we learned is that sometimes that meant he just needed to even share his thought process with me for me to understand. Because sometimes the miscommunication that would happen between us early on in our marriage is I would feel like he hadn't heard anything I said. And that wasn't really the case. He had just thought through a lot of that. But he just didn't think to share that because that wasn't, like, he wasn't used to it. We were newly married. We hadn't, that just wasn't part of how we communicated at that point. And so for me, I kind of share all my thought process. And so obviously there's also things that I've had to learn, like, we don't have a lot of time. Okay, what's what's our main focus here? What do I need to get out? What's helpful in the conversation? And what's helpful in the conversation that I need to add in that I'm leaving out that will help us actually get on a better communication. But that goes, I think, just to loving and knowing each other and understanding how each of us is different. And I think that's important too, because I think even with our spouse, even if they need to speak up more or we feel like they talk too much, we still need to be patient and understanding with them and love them through that.
Yeah, I think that would be my final thing. Like, as we've talked, even, you can see how different people can be and how much learning has to take place in order to communicate well. And so we should expect bumps along the way, misunderstandings. And so I think that patience and grace towards each other is so important. Again, just thinking about how Christ has been patient with me and shown grace towards me. So hopefully that starts the conversation. Obviously, we're not arrived in this, but yeah, hopefully that gets the conversation going with you and your spouse or people that you live with. But yeah, hope that's helpful. I love you guys. Have a great day.
Bye.
See ya.